Hey, it's Thomas here, and today we're going to be checking out the only circulation pump I've ever seen that uses maglev technology, the Tunze Stream 3. And yes, this is a beastly pump made for bigger tanks. Heck, it even has claws. And there's nothing else out there quite like it, except for maybe one little nano pump, but we'll get into that. As reefers, we know how critical of a role water circulation plays in our reef tanks, and that getting enough of the right kind of water movement is as important to our corals as lighting, dosing, or nutrition. There does seem to be a sort of sweet spot in our hobby where tank size and the amount of gear options that are available to us intersect. If you have a really small tank, you have far less options than somebody with an average size tank, and if you have a really large tank, same thing, you have less options. But if you're on the larger end of that scale, this is definitely a pump you should have your eyes on. Tunze Turbelle Stream 3 is an incredible DC controllable circulation pump that uses maglev technology that involves zirconium oxide bearings and a brushless magnetic drive motor to levitate the massive and frankly demonic looking impeller to create tons of flow while eliminating contact points between moving parts, which results in an incredibly silent, more efficient, and very low maintenance flow pump. It uses the same capable yet simple Turbelle controller Tunze users have come to love, but if you prefer, it also has 0 to 10 volt compatibility. It comes with 3 swappable flow guards to change the behavior of the flow the pump creates, which adds to its flexibility. Plus, this pump carries a 60-month warranty. Yup, 5 years. And I love me a nice long warranty. It really shows that this beast of a pump is built to last. In my humble opinion, it is one of, if not the absolute coolest pieces of pump technology we have in the hobby, and it makes it all the more bewildering to me as to why I don't see more hobbyists using this pump, which leads me to believe that more hobbyists just don't really know about this pump and how dang awesome it is. So let's fix that and get it out of the box. In the box, you'll find the Stream 3 pump attached to the Turbelle controller, the magnetic mounts, various flow attachments including the rectifier, the flow deflector, and the honeycomb attachment which is already on the pump, the foam guard, the power supply and power cable, as well as the user manual, the quality control card, and adhesive strips for mounting the controller. The Stream 3 is a larger pump sitting at 3.7 inches by 2.7 inches by 7.2 inches long or tall, depending on how you orient the pump in your tank. So yes, this pump is on the larger side. However, something to consider is that Tunze tends to be quite modest with their flow ratings compared to other pump manufacturers. So while the Stream 3 has a flow rating of roughly 4,000 gallons per hour with a minimum flow of 660 gallons per hour that can be controlled with the included 7090 Turbelle controller, when you consider its power consumption of between 3.5 to 50 watts, that nearly 4,000 gallon per hour flow rating is likely to be notably stronger than other propeller pumps with similar flow ratings, which becomes even more apparent when you notice that Tunze rates the Stream 3 for tanks between 75 and 800 gallons. 800 gallons tank volume. 800. On that note, if you are going to use it on smaller 4-foot tanks or like a 3-foot cube, I would highly recommend using the flow deflector, not just so you can hide it more easily, but also so you can use the surface of the water in your aquarium to help dissipate and distribute the flow without having to turn the pump down too dramatically. Speaking of mounting and mounting options, the Stream 3 uses a pair of Tunze's waterproof magnetic mounts with silicone buffers to hold it firmly on panels up to 15 millimeters or 2/3 of an inch thick while absorbing whatever tiny vibration is produced by this maglev pump. The pump can be mounted in just about any orientation, even on the overflow box thanks to those external magnets also being waterproof, and when coupled with the water deflector, it can act just like a jumbo version of the much smaller Nano Stream 6040 with the ability to be pointed in virtually any direction. There are also a couple other attachments that change the flow characteristics of the pump that I'll touch on shortly. They're super cool, but it is important to note that Tunze does provide some minimum distances that the pump needs to be away from the substrate depending on how it's oriented to prevent it from accidentally sucking up the substrate and clogging or blowing it all over the tank due to the powerful nature of the pump. When mounted vertically, like you would mount it with the flow deflector I was just talking about, the bottom of the pump body should be at least 2 inches off of the substrate, and if mounted horizontally, which is what you're likely to do with the other attachments, you'll want the intake strainer or cage around the impeller to be roughly 8 inches or so off of the substrate. Now, for bare bottom tanks, those safe distances will be less critical. However, it is a good idea to also use the provided foam guard around the intake strainer in systems with smaller fish and inverts, especially if it is mounted closer to the bottom of the tank. If you do want to run the pump horizontally or down the length of a large aquarium, Tunze provides a couple of attachments to manipulate the flow to best suit your needs. First off, you can run the pump without any attachment at all, and it'll provide a strong, broad fanning flow pattern with the highest possible flow rate. If you want a bit more punch, you can add the honeycomb attachment to create a gentle and more uniform flow while also protecting fish or other inhabitants from entering the face of the pump. For applications where you want as much punch as possible, for example, to get flow from one end to the other end on an 8-foot tank, the rectifier attachment will create an intense directional flow with a lot of velocity. And like I mentioned earlier, the flow deflector attachment is a great option for hiding the pump or sneaking it into odd or interesting spots, while also being able to direct the flow of the pump perpendicular to the axis of the rotor, which is just a fancy way of saying it's going to come out at an angle away from the impeller instead of straight out like you would expect. The 7090 Turbelle controller will be very familiar to anyone who has had the pleasure of working with a Tunze DC pump. You can dial in constant flow from 660 to 4,000 gallons per hour, or set up a pulsing effect with the ability to adjust both the minimum and maximum speeds, as well as the frequency of the pulse. You can also use the auto adjust feature to dial in standing waves if that's your jam. Plus, you have a feed button, which is pretty standard these days. The Stream 3 can also be controlled via a 0 to 10 volt with a third-party controller, provided you pick up the appropriate Tunze link cable. It is important to note, however, that the minimum speed the pump can run is around that 660 gallons per hour, or around 15% intensity, so don't let it go lower than that, or the impeller will stop rotating and the pump will need to go through its startup sequence to get the impeller levitating again, which does take a few moments. For that same reason, you'll want to avoid any on-off style timers or outlets on your third-party controller and stick to either the 7090 controller that comes with the pump or a properly set up 0 to 10 volt port. Something I really dig is that the Stream 3 is compatible with Tunze's safety connector, making it battery backup ready, which is awesome. It can also use other accessories like the photo cell for automatic night mode and Y cables for hooking up more than one Stream 3 to work in sync or in anti-sync. When it comes to maintenance, the Stream 3 is going to be pretty dang easy considering it has less parts to worry about. However, the process of installing and removing the impeller is completely different from any other pump I've worked with in the past, so I highly recommend reading pages 46 through 50 of the user manual so you can get familiar with it. It only takes a second to do, but knowing how to do it is going to make a big difference. Mind you, they do say maintenance should be done once a year or possibly more, depending on how quickly it builds up with precipitate or coralline, but still, that's pretty dang low maintenance for a flow pump and likely due to its frictionless design. So it might be a good idea to practice removing and reinstalling the impeller at least a few times before you accidentally lose the user manual and then have to try to remember how you're supposed to do it when you go to clean the pump an entire year later. A year's a long time to remember something. Who am I? Where am I? What's going on? Oh, right. See what I mean? Look, if you love digging into the latest pump technology and the beastly Stream 3, claws and all, matches your monster reefing mantra, you can pick one up for yourself by clicking right here. If you dare.